Hello, the internet. Welcome to the podcast Byzantium and Friends. I am Anthony, your host. If I sound a bit different today, it is because I have misplaced my microphone. So the audio might not be as good, but when I recorded the episode, I was using it, so that should sound normal. Now, longtime listeners of the podcast will know that I have tried to dedicate episodes to the life cycle of the average person in the society that we all study and love. And we've had episodes on birth, and infancy, and childhood, and health and disease as known through analysis of skeletal remains, and a number of episodes on daily life generally, but I'm trying to kind of work through the life cycle, at which point our next stop would be sort of transitions from adolescence to adulthood. And I thought it would be fascinating to focus first on girls and women. And very fortunately, an amazing study of precisely one aspect of this came into my hands at just the right moment. And this is a detailed study by Gabriel Radle, who is a professor in the Department of Theology at the University of Notre Dame, who specializes in liturgical studies. And we'll get to that in a moment. It's important. Now, the article in question focuses on the question of veils and generally headscarves and, did women wear them and which women and when and what do we know about it and what did it signify? And in particular, at the moment when girls seem to have gone through some sort of quasi-liturgical ritual where their hair was bound up in some way, and presumably there was some kind of headgear involved. Now, I want to talk about that kind of ritual itself in my introduction here, because it's known from a set of prayer books that we have very, very many of these, and they're collections of prayers that presumably priests speak at specific moments when their congregations ask them. And these are fascinating and very little studied sources for social life and daily experiences and so on. There are whole collections of which prayer to use at specific moments or moments of tension or uncertainty. There's a drought, rumors of barbarians coming, your kid is going off to school, or you name it. One person who's studying these collections, both trying to trace the transmission and the process by which the prayers were collected, where, when, and so forth, but also what they tell us about social life, is Claudia Rapp, the University of Vienna. And at that conference, she gave me this sort of incredible peek into, just how much they reveal and how little studied they are. Now, we would certainly benefit from a comprehensive global study of these texts, but also from very individual focused ones. And that's what we're going to be doing today. So there is one of these prayers in particular concerns the binding up of the hair of a young maiden. And that's the one that we'll be talking about today. Now, this is important for a number of reasons, which you may recall from our episodes on dress and these sort of really dark areas in what we know about Byzantine dress or what we don't know. And women's veils and headgear and scarves in general are one of those areas. Our sources give very contradictory indications about who wore them, when, and so forth. And I thought that a sort of comprehensive discussion of those kinds of questions would be inherently fascinating and fill in some of those gaps, as the article in fact does, by using a wide range of textual and visual sources, including Psellos a lot, because he wrote about women, the women in his family. So this is a wonderful case study of how a liturgical approach coupled with some textual and visual art historical evidence, just produces the really the best results. And so I was interested in the methodological implications here as well, and sort of the possibility for convergence among these different disciplines that doesn't happen too often. So without any further delay, here is my discussion with Gabriel. Thanks as always to medievalist.net for reposting these episodes on their website. Here we go. Gabriel, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks. It's great to be here.
So you've written the most fascinating article that I've read about women's veiling and women's hair in Byzantium. And it's so detailed, and you tie it to so many things, literature and liturgy and other things that start with lit. And anyway, now I think it's important to state for the audience that you didn't come to this question of women's veiling from a background in the study of gender and women's history, which obviously you do have, you've done your basics and so forth, but you come from the area of the study of liturgy, which is your main area of expertise. So can you tell us a little bit about that study area and how it led you to write this fascinating article on veiling?
Sure. Yeah, that's a straightforward question, but it's got a pretty long answer. So I'll try to keep it as succinct as possible. So yeah, you mentioned my background's in liturgy, the study of the history of Byzantine liturgy most specifically. And I come from a formation that's very specific. I studied in the city of Rome at the Pontifical Oriental Institute, where I did most of my graduate formation. And that's a place where I had the fortune to study under the last generation of these Jesuit scholars of the history of Byzantine religion, who were especially focused on the history of liturgy and the study of liturgical manuscripts. And they kind of brought the best of two worlds together. If you think of 19th and 20th century German comparative textual analysis with what was, prior to the revolution in Russia, this sort of 19th, early 20th century amazing Russian schools of the study of Byzantine religious history. And so they were really trying to bring these two things together. And in fact, some of the early founders of the Pontifical Oriental Institute went and bought entire, running series of collections of periodicals and stuff from Russia, to the point that you have, at the Oriental Institute today, some of the only complete running series of some, early Byzantine journals from a pre-revolutionary Russia. So it was this interesting school and an interesting moment to be there, and to really get a training in working with Byzantine liturgical manuscripts. For people who are familiar with Byzantine studies, they'll be familiar with some of the names in the study of Byzantine liturgy, people like Juan Mateos, Robert Taft. And from the outside of Byzantine liturgical studies, one could easily get the impression that a lot has been done, because there are these massive tomes of books that can be intimidating to the outsider, where you'll have hundreds of pages written on rubrical changes within manuscript texts. But as one looks at the manuscript sources, one quickly realizes that so much has not been done. The manuscripts that these sort of giants in the field looked at, they were looking at small portions of these texts, focused on rites like the Eucharist or baptism. And in these same manuscripts, you have tons of liturgical practices of the Byzantine world that have yet to be systematically studied. Yeah. And for people outside the field, it would be really important to point out that the majority of our texts from the Byzantine world are liturgical texts. When you look at catalogs, we see them categorized, in these particular ways, where you'll have like biblical texts as one category, and then liturgical texts as a separate category. And what catalogers mean is like a priest prayer book. And then you'll have hymnography books. But all of these texts, whether they be the biblical lectionaries, the priest prayer books, the hymnographic books, these were all liturgical books, and they all functioned within these embodied practices. And so, yeah. I mean, this is this field of these mountains of manuscripts that haven't been studied that I try to go through and make sense of, me and a group of others in this field. And specifically what I've been working on the last several years has been on the history of marriage in Byzantium, told primarily through these unedited manuscript texts that conserve the rites of betrothal and matrimony. And it's important to point out that when we talk about Byzantine liturgy, the Byzantine political realm had fluctuating borders. The Eastern Roman Empire shifted in its territorial control, but the Byzantine religious tradition continued to thrive in areas that were outside those borders. So when we talk about the history of Byzantine liturgy, it's a history that's kind of the history of multiple different regions. And that's one of the methodological issues we deal with, is we're dealing with multiple regional liturgical traditions that interacted, but were also distinct. So places like southern Italy, for which we have a disproportionately large number of sources, Salento, Calabria, Sicily, going all the way to the Syro-Palestinian region and everything in between. So we're looking at multiple different Byzantine religious traditions.
Yeah, I think what you said about the manuscripts is important to stress, because obviously many of us in the field, myself included, have either a historian's bias or a classicist bias or both. And so we're drawn to Eustathius commentary on Homer, or Telos, chronographia, and that's one manuscript.
Right.
But if you were to look through the catalogs, just as you said, it's more like liturgical, prayer book, liturgical,
right?
Maybe something secular, and start again, right?
Yeah, and you see that bias played out in digitization projects, or microfilm projects of the 20th century. So that can be the frustrating thing, which necessitates scholars of liturgy having to do a lot of visits to these, collections.
Yes.
So to your point about how I got into veiling, it came through this back door, of looking at marriage ritual. Because in looking at the history of marriage in Byzantium, regionally, I was looking also at Slavonic sources that were derivative, for the most part, from Greek manuscripts, but also made interesting changes to their marriage practices according to local specific Slavic cultural practices. And one of these shows up in a late Byzantine, late medieval Balkan region. We find that some Slavic communities had this very peculiar practice of veiling a new bride. In fact, one of the manuscripts is very specific. It says that they veiled her after her first sexual encounter with her new husband. So it was a sort of status change into becoming, a matron, and putting on her matron's head garb. And this was very interesting because this was not showing up at all in the Byzantine sources. And yet, in the oldest Byzantine liturgical manuscripts, this same prayer shows up, but it shows up for a completely different purpose. So that's how I got into trying to uncover what is this text originally, and how is it different from what these late medieval Slavs adapted it to.
Yeah, and to give a bit of background, and correct me if I get any of this wrong, when we're talking about liturgical manuscripts or prayer books, it's not just like the liturgy that someone might imagine, is sort of performed on Sundays or Easter or whatever, but there's this whole host of, prayers and rites that are conducted in association with all kinds of events in life, right? And you mentioned marriage, but I was actually speaking with Claudia Rapp, who's at Vienna. She's running a project that's trying to, put some order into these things.
Right.
But they're like, you go and you ask the priest for a prayer for all kinds of things. And she mentioned the first day that a child goes to school.
Exactly. Blessing your flock of sheep, building a new house. There's multiple versions of some of these texts, which shows you how popular these practices were.
Okay, so let's talk about the ritual that is the rite of binding up a woman's head.
Right.
I'm just quoting here. So where and when and for whom would this have been performed? And how do you see this rite?
Yeah, so I think this rite that shows up among some of the earliest Byzantine liturgical manuscripts is what we might call a coming of age ritual for young women. We have a lot of early Christian male-authored texts that speak about a supposed importance for the coverage of women's heads, especially their hair. And these texts imply, or sometimes they even state explicitly, that these social expectations began at puberty. So it's important for women to have their head covered. We can talk more about that if you want some of these specific texts. But I think that the prayer is clearly functioning in that milieu. It's showing up already in the earliest Byzantine manuscripts. Our first Byzantine priest prayer book is from Calabria, and it's from the late 8th century. And so anytime we have a text that shows up there, it's a bit of a guessing game how much further back it goes. But we know it goes back further because this prayer book that was copied in Calabria has a lot of rites that have nothing to do with Calabria, rites concerning the emperor, concerning the patriarch. So we know that a Constantinopolitan model was being used by this Calabrian scribe in the late 700s. And so this is one of those prayers that shows up there. So it's, I believe, older than that manuscript. And I think it goes back probably, to circa 5th, 6th century, based off of the circulation of patristic texts around the importance of women's head coverage. And the reason why it's a coming of age ritual, in my opinion, is not only because the text itself makes a number of allusions to a woman's coming of age, but in some of the manuscripts, this rite for the binding up of a woman's hair or head is found immediately adjacent to a prayer for a man's first shave, which would be the male counterpart.
Right.
Yeah, which is another text I hope to look at and work on in the future.
Yeah, and you do a wonderful job in the article of tying this to ancient practices and conceptions of women's hair and these and veiling and binding up, and we'll talk in a moment about what those words mean, and stretching them out into the Byzantine continuum. So let's get let's get granular here and ask what exactly is being referred to, because what is the language of binding up the hair mean, and how does it relate to the term of veiling, which you use? Because modern audiences will think of a number of practices when they when they hear veiling, anything from a burqa to headscarf or whatever.
Yeah.
So, and I know the language is opaque, and I don't want to press you to make a commitment here that's that you feel unsafe or uncertain about, but. How precise can we be about the actual practices that are being described?
Yeah, so your point about ambiguity is very true. When I've talked about this with some people, informally, I'll realize midway through the conversation that they're imagining a Byzantine hijab or something, or they could be projecting on to past Byzantine women a type of full maphorion, like a huge large textile that we would see in Byzantine icons of early female saints or the Theotokos. Right. So you've got these different imaginings that go on. It's like you say, the text itself refers to head coverings, but the title of the prayer is the rite for binding up. Originally, the earliest sources say binding up a woman, and then later texts will add, think of the head of a woman. So and that's because I think hair is a metonym for the person, and we find that all over texts. So the earliest scribes didn't need to specify what was being talked about. The hair was at issue, and I think what we find, being represented is that the idea of binding up is emblematic of ordering a person's life. And so what we see is a young girl going from, let's say, the carefree years of her youth and free-flowing hair to taking that hair, binding it up, putting it under control, and manifesting self-control as she's entering into puberty and adulthood. There's also, I think, sexual notions in terms of sexual self-control that are implied in the text and also embedded within notions of women's hair. And so I think the most important thing is binding up, keeping it orderly, if you will. And then a variety of different hair coverings could be used. And also depending on the social circumstance, who's in her company. But I think the coverage The binding up and the coverage are the main issues. And the prayer is specifically ambiguous about what's doing that coverage. And I think the coverage would vary based on circumstance and vary also based on, if we can use the word, fashion or at least style. And this is an important point because as I've walked around and looked at like Neo-Byzantine images, I was last year, I was looking, in the Hram Svetog Sava in Belgrade, this massive church that they just finished decorating, modeled, kind of in part on Hagia Sophia. And they just finished all the mosaics and the frescoes there. I was walking around and there are a number of female saints who are depicted with free-flowing hair and a veil on top, which is not typical for actual Byzantine imagery, where the hair is generally ordered, meaning bound up, tied up, and then you'll have a veil put on top. So what you find is people today are often projecting back and even projecting onto Byzantine art notions that we have of what head coverage means today. But this notion of binding up seems to be critical importance, at least in late antiquity.
Yeah, and I can easily imagine how different communities could use that same prayer and believe that they're participating in the same ritual that might have had some antiquity behind it by that point, but are actually doing very different things with the hair and with the
Exactly.
But think that they're doing this time-honored thing, right?
Right. Yeah, that's the history of liturgy in a certain way. Yeah, and trying to parse out, where is the continuity and where is the continuity of interpretation about things that are quite different. Yeah.
Yes. So we should sort of methodologically allow for a kind of spectrum of practices. Some in which the hair is bound up in a knot. I don't know if we can imagine like those like early imperial Roman, female dues, that are like so elaborate, they're works of art in themselves. Okay, so probably not that. And the veiling could probably also take very many forms, from, something more strict that hides more to even possibly a hairnet. Like, is that one of the possibilities that you came across?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, we have, we don't have a lot of material textile evidence from late antiquity in Byzantium, but we have some, and there have been archaeological studies of women's burials in late antique Egypt, where they found a variety of different types of head coverings in the tombs, including, among other things, hairnets. So it goes back to that thing of, binding up. And then we find this in classical, Greek texts, this idea of binding up the hair, but then probably fluctuation of what's actually going on top of that bound up hair. And, we have late antique busts of women wearing sort of like turbans that are going to bind up the hair. Chrysostom in one text talks about the importance of wrapping up hair on all sides. So he seems to sort of be alluding to the way in a particular style, if you're wrapping up on all sides. These styles probably shifted, but the binding up is the key, and it could fluctuate in terms of what's actually exposed in terms of hair.
And because this is part of a social symbolic order, right? Like it designates certain moral qualities, just like you said, it functions within a framework that also has its opposite. And it's great that in the article you also talk about women with loose hair. So in what context are women shown or talked about with loose hair, and what did that signify?
Yeah, so precisely because it's such a strong, association with orderliness and decorum and social moral norms. Artists and individuals could use the absence of a head covering to communicate various things. So one iconographic motif that we find is of female martyrs who, female saints, typically represented with very bound up, very covered hair. But there's an exception to that. We have many examples of illuminations and images where a female saint is being martyred, but with loose hair, and that sort of communicates the violence being perpetrated against her. But you could also have artists play with that same thing. So there's a really neat fresco in a church in Salento. I think it's like 13th century, of the martyr Margarita, and she is stripped nude and boiled in a cauldron. So she's being sexually humiliated in her nudity, and yet the artists have one item of clothing on her, and it's her head wrap, her head covering, precisely to say that despite her sexual humiliation, she's still preserving her sexual, purity through, the symbol of that veil, communicating that. But you also have Maddie Mayer has done some work on this. There's images of women in a state of sexual sin can be shown with loose hair. And then there's notions of loose hair that go back all the way to ancient Greece, the rending of a veil, letting hair hang out as a sign of mourning. And that's something that ethnographers have even studied in southeastern rural European communities to this day. Letting the hair hang out loose, when mourning a husband or a father is typical. And then there's exceptional cases. Saint Mary of Egypt is one. She's typically represented with loose hair, and she looks very similar in some depictions to John the Baptist. Who lived in the same Judean desert, so there's probably some intentional play there. But there's sort of this idea of probably connected to the issues of mourning and repentance, and also could just simply be communicating a sort of angelic sexlessness resulting from her extreme asceticism. So there's different ways in which both real individuals and then artists played with issues of veiling and unveiling in communicating.
Yeah, these are very important categories to mention, because one might think that loose hair would straightforwardly indicate loose morals, and even in English, the two words kind of resonate in that way. But that's not the case, because as you illustrated, it can mean a range of things, and especially in the ascetic case, I think I'm remembering an image of Theoctisti, who's an extreme ascetic, living alone, is kind of emaciated, is wearing rags. I think her hair is loose, but in that case, it's like this person is so removed from the norms of social life,
exactly,
that even those rules of decorum have sort of ceased to apply, and no one would suspect her loose hair of indicating loose morals. Because
exactly,
it's kind of like opposites meet. In this case, like if you want to be a married, respectable matron, you signify your decency through these outward signs of social conformity and so on. But for someone who's just outside of that framework altogether, those sort of cease to matter. I just find it fascinating how these play out.
And it's ironic because one of the the situations in which Chrysostom's responding to is probably the Eustathian group, which was being accused of having women dress as men, and in its ascetic leaning. So there's sort of you see this ascetic use of loose hair, both accepted and rejected.
Yeah, the Eustathian group is just so fascinating. I think it's a council at Gangra that condemns them and lists the sorts of things that they were supposed to be doing, right? So, like, they repudiate marriage, they repudiate their children, they have equality of the sexes, like all this stuff, and it just sounds that slaves, I think, were supposed to leave their masters, and all kinds of cats and dogs living together. Anyway, that's a great group. Okay, so let's go back a little bit to the particulars here. Have you come across references to veiling that imply that the face or part of the face was also covered?
Yes, but we should say that the evidence for Byzantine women specifically covering their face is scant. There is one reference that refers to the practice in the context of the Comnenian revolt. So in the 12th century, Anna Comneni is writing about an event that occurred in 1081, where there's this shift of power, and these Comnenian elite women are, during this revolt, needing to go unnoticed, be disguised, and they try to go to Hagia Sophia. They go to the cathedral disguised, pretending to be visitors from the East who are going to pay a visit to the church and try to get past the guards that way. And at that point, all we're told is that they're going disguised, as women pilgrims. But then when their identity is disclosed, we hear of one of them removing the veil from her face, implying that part of their disguise was to go as these visiting women with veiled faces. So I think what that tells us is that, bottom line, Middle Byzantine Constantinopolitan women themselves probably aren't regularly putting a face covering on, but in cosmopolitan Middle Byzantine Constantinople, it wouldn't have been unheard of to encounter a woman walking on the street with a veil, pulled over her face. So it was not unknown.
Right.
And this, today we tend to associate types of veils and face coverings with religion. And that's because of the politicization of veils that we have, in various Western European countries and even in North America. And of course, certain laws that have been passed against face veils, et cetera. But this is not a religious thing for much of the pre-modern world. For example, Tertullian, this is pre-Islam. Tertullian, he really wants women to be covered. He writes an entire treatise on the veiling of women. And in this, he makes a passing remark complimenting the women of pre-Islamic Arabia, who he claims cover everything but one eye.
Right.
Leaving one eye, for visibility. So this idea of the face veil, being tied to Islam, is in some ways accidental insofar as it's tied to cultural modes of dress that circulate, in the Near Eastern world. And I think within Byzantium writ large, and within the different communities that Byzantine, religious communities are coming into contact with, you're going to have a variety of different types of head coverings that extend to the face as well.
Yes, and there's the trope in ancient historiography where, in order to kill a tyrant, the tyrannicides, dress up as the women who go to the parties that the tyrant is.
Right.
Obviously, they would have covered their face because
exactly
a bunch of ancient Greeks don't enter a party simply dressed, with a dress on. It's like, I'm a woman.
Right. Yeah.
Okay. So do veils do anything sort of pragmatically, so beyond their symbolic function? What does this ordering of the hair and, or having to wear a veil, or whether it's a net or a scarf or whatever, what does that actually do physically, or it might have been intended to do in the life of a woman?
Yeah. So, there's, of course, as you mentioned, the most basic level, which is signaling modesty, decorum. And like many things, I think it's hard to speak universally for all of Byzantium, but at least for the early period, in which a head covering seems to be functioning as a custom of female dress assumed at puberty, then I think it's also signifying adulthood. I think it's just signaling the assumption of responsibility, of reproductive age. And when we think of, marriage practices and the relative, young ages at which people were being married, I think this is not insignificant, that's signaling in a very public way. And then there's the liturgical text itself. It connects, this sexual component. The text itself refers to the head covering as aiding a young woman in educating herself towards self-control. So there's this, you could say it's a tool in some ways. Anthropologists have worked a bit on, the use of liturgy for developing virtue. Talal Assad is one of them, who's looked at Benedictine monastic rules, like the practice of prostrating before a guest of the monastery. And he talks about how, this is not just, enacting a particular virtue, but it's about practicing a particular virtue, by regularly prostrating in front of the person who's interrupting your regular, community life. You are trying to develop within yourself this honoring of a guest as, someone greater than you. And so this, because of all these notions that are embedded within Byzantine culture about head coverage, about covering, then the very act of having a ceremony to assume your veil at the first time, and then repeating that act, thenceforth in one's life, I think it's signaling, also a It's a gesture that communicates, but in assuming it, one is also practicing the very things that the text itself, defines the veil as, or the head covering as.
And there are also practical limitations that it imposes, outdoor activity or, dancing, extreme parkour.
Right. Yeah. And this goes back to the whole thing of, how did veils look, what's being shown, how much coverage. And this, I think, varied across, social classes. I think it also varied regarding, what women are doing. A woman who's, working regularly, in the house or outside the house in the field is going to have, different, different practices in terms of how much body coverage she's going to be practically able to carry out versus, a teenager in Constantinople of an aristocratic household.
Right, because the more decorum you can practice, the more, and it's, in a certain sense, that's it correlates with class, because you have servants and other people who can do things for you, so that you can remain kind of aloof from the grubby material things that most people have to do.
Yeah, and what comes to mind is like Sharon Gerstel's work on late Byzantine, rural life, and like the bones of late Byzantine women showing all the stress of rigorous labor that they went through in many places. It's I think there's definitely the social class issue that would have played out in dress as well. Yeah.
So tell us about the link between hair and sex, because you bring that out in many parts of the article. I found it fascinating.
Yeah. Veiling and binding is very much tied up with sex. And we find this, this goes back to Homer. You have, the word kridivnon doesn't show up in this text specifically, but you have it in other texts of Greece where, this one word can be used to signal a head covering. It can be used to signal a city's defensive structures. And then it can also be extended to the female anatomy. So you have this, this Homeric euphemism, of, when you're breaking through a city's walls, it's also, sexual penetration or violation. And there's this, very complex, how to put it, there's a complex issue of the eroticization of sexual violence that we have in antiquity that carries into late antiquity. Michael Rosenberg has done some really interesting work on this, and how late antique rabbis and church authorities are both trying to respond to this sort of male rhetoric around the eroticization of sexual violence. And but we find it in the vocabulary that carries in this idea of protection, and that the breaking of those barriers of protection is symbolized with sexual access. And this goes back to Hittite, Middle Assyrian texts. We have it's really, really embedded in Near Eastern and Mediterranean culture, where we've got in Middle Assyrian law books, we have a text that clearly define which women should be veiled in public and which women cannot. In other words, it's illegal and you will be beaten for wearing a veil in public. And it's all about male control and patronage. So, for example, wives are to be veiled in public, daughters are to be veiled in public, and even concubines are to be veiled in public, because they all have a male patron. Whereas a prostitute has to be unveiled, according to Middle Assyrian law, has to be unveiled in public because it's a symbol of her sexual exploitability. And it's illegal for a prostitute to veil herself. So this is really deeply embedded, and it passes into Greek culture. It passes into Byzantine culture. One text specifically Byzantine that jumps out is there's the 9th century life of Ioannikios, and I really like that text because the saint, he stumbles into a woman who's described as being possessed by the spirit of fornication, and the text goes on to explicitly describe her as letting her hair hang loose. So these two things are linked: spirit of fornication, loose hair. And then when she wants to be healed by Ioannikios, she asks him to heal her, but her words are so indicative. She says, "Bind me up, bind me with self-control." And so the reason I really like that text is it's directly linking for us in a 9th century Byzantine text that connection between loose hair, loose morals, binding up the hair, and binding up one's sexual moral life. Yeah.
Nice. I was wondering if so. The Hittite and Assyrian examples are fascinating. They're sort of adjacent. They're similar to Byzantine practice. I think sort of Byzantine could understand their symbolic logic in a way. Are there societies where veiling or binding up sort of signify something sort of significantly different or markedly different? Just so we have a context of the range of possibilities here. So you mentioned some other societies where it just kind of seems to signify something else.
Yeah, I mean, we find this even in contemporary veiling cultures today, that there's different meanings. So the easiest example would be looking at contemporary Orthodox Judaism. And this is something that we find also in late medieval Slavic cultures, where the assumption of a head covering is indicative of marital status, where a woman is not to wear a head covering until she has married. And that's what we have in contemporary Orthodox Judaism. And yet I suggest that what we find in contemporary Orthodox Judaism of a woman assuming a head covering or a veil or a wig from the moment of marriage is actually probably East European practice that's tied up with the same Slavic customs, because you can find Jewish communities today, like Yemenite Jewish communities and others, where they're still conserving that older Near Eastern practice of veils are more ubiquitous. They're not necessarily just a marital status, but women from the moment of puberty start to assume them, which is what you have in many Muslim societies to this day. So I'd say the biggest distinction that you find in both in the Middle Ages and to today is where some communities will use veils not as a coming of age dress practice, but as indicative of marital status, which in many of these communities are closely linked because people are getting married so young. But
Sure. Okay. That's fascinating. So tell us some of your favorite texts, Byzantine texts about women's hair. So you talk about quite a few of them. Which are the ones that you find most evocative and why?
yeah, well, that, like I mentioned already, that Life of Eutychius, I love it because it makes that point for me about linking the two. But there's many others. The Life of Pelagia is another one that describes her not covering her head before her conversion. And then for the early Byzantine period, we've got Chrysostom, we've got others, we've got Cyril of Alexandria. He calls the covering of a woman's head part of natural law. And then for later centuries, there's a text well because you translated it, the encomium for his mother, Michael Psellos. There's a reference there to that common trope of the converted prostitute. It's you find it all over text, this converted prostitute, and he picks up on it. The prostitute who now converts and covers her hair. But it's interesting because he even alludes to her covering her face there in that text. That's another one of the few. But he also, undercuts that claim because he refers to former clients recognizing her on the street. So, it's sort of this trope of, the more coverage, the more you're manifesting, your conversion, even if temporary in that case. But yeah, there's that. I mean, that's one of the difficult things that when you're looking at these texts, how much is, using the how much are we using a common trope, and how much is it indicative of actual real dress practices? And I think there's enough evidence to indicate that it was, an issue within real dress practices, but we also have to be cautious. Yeah.
You're exactly right, and especially about women. And it goes back to, I think, Alexander Kazhdan, who realized that the way in which Byzantine authors talked about women's lives was more indebted in some respects to ancient, classical tropes about like the women's quarters and things like this, which may not have existed in reality outside the palace or, some other extremely conservative place. And that we might have just been projecting all of these ancient Greek customs that just became sort of embedded in the language of writing about certain kinds of things in classical authors.
Yeah, and Kazhdan draws out many examples of women moving freely, or what we, more freely in society. And I would take that a step further. I would say one of the things that enabled that free movement is precisely because a Byzantine woman when traveling, semi-independently or moving more freely than scholars had previously imagined, is because she's able to manifest a certain degree of modesty and decorum within her publicly performed, dress habits. Yeah.
Oh yes, there's so much evidence for female mobility and running businesses and managing their properties and in public and so forth. That's undeniable. But yeah, so let's. Oh, that's a bell. Sorry, that's the radon inspectors. They're coming to pick up their gear. I don't think I need to get involved in it. So let's bring this back to your home turf, which is liturgy, and the study of the history of religion. So is there specifically religious significance to hair binding or veiling that you see through your study of liturgy?
Certainly. So I think the fact that this form of dress habit of binding up, covering the hair, is assumed as a part of a religious ceremony, of a liturgical blessing that's officiated, by a Byzantine priest, it elevates this social norm to a religious significance. And it's no secret that liturgy was a major player within Byzantine society, from sacraments to stational processions, it's everywhere. So when a social norm of dress is one that's being advocated by influential, church authorities, when that social norm is being elevated to formal liturgy, becomes part of formal ritual, a rite of passage, if you will, within human development. I think it had the potential to make that dress object itself a religious object. And for devout Byzantine women, presumably that performance of modesty through the head binding and the head coverage later in life, throughout one's life, would be linked to that religious meaning defined in the Rite. Now, not the case for all women. Some of them are just, doing it out of habit, out of expectation, but that dimension of religious devotion has to be there for at least some of these women, and their agency within that was certainly present. And in fact, the Rite itself even alludes to a female attendant that's helping the woman in her binding up. So female agency, I think, is really important thing to acknowledge here. And what a rite of passage does, if to use anthropology, a rite of passage is a ritual that's providing a new definition for someone entering into a new stage of life. And so I think that's what the Rite is doing, and that's what the Rite is connecting to this object of dress. And there's other ritual significances of dress for Byzantium. I mean, for Constantinople specifically, we have relics of the Theotokos' clothing, including her veil.
Right.
So that was an object of veneration for Constantinopolitan men and women. And we even have, there's a Syriac text that refers to one empress in the 5th century, Eudokia, donating her veil to be used as an altar cloth.
Right, yes.
And so we've got head coverings and, veils that are also interacting with other significance, other symbolic meanings of veils used in the liturgy. I mean, textiles are everywhere, right? And they're in churches, and they're often being used liturgically for covering sacred objects, veiling sanctuary spaces, placing veils over the chalice and discos. So veils signify something that's important. We find them used in imperial ceremonial, we've got, by signifying the woman's body with a veil, you also have those, ideas of signifying something sacred, which is, part of, I mean, not to remove this from the issue of, the male male dominance within society, but there are these a whole range of ways in which women themselves are also interacting with these veiling practices. If we think also just of textile production and artistic craft being carried out by women who are making the very objects that they are assuming within the rites and within daily practice of veiling. There's a lot there.
That's fascinating. Thank you. Any final thoughts on this topic you leave our audience with?
I just say, I think this rite is one of many, many cases that really stress how interesting liturgy is for studying social history, Byzantine cultural history. And, a lot of, as I mentioned at the beginning, a lot of, scholars, including Byzantinists, have come to associate the study of liturgy with combing through manuscripts, compiling lists of charts, and lengthy discussions of how one little minute liturgical gesture gets changed over time, and that is true. And liturgiologists haven't always done the best to speak our craft to broader audiences. And there's a lot of factors to consider, one of which is, just the great, immensity of work that has yet to be done on some of the most basic levels of combing through these sources. But, for every aspect of Byzantine life, it played out in one way or another, generally in the liturgy or interacted with the liturgy. So, for those studying imperial ceremony, there's lots of liturgical rites, not just, things in the book of ceremonies. If there's a social phenomenon or historical phenomenon in Byzantium, it's reflected in these manuscripts. You've got everyone can find something in liturgy. Byzantine environment studies are really big today. We've got prayers and rites for earthquakes and drought. And so that's my apologia, if you will, for Byzantine liturgical studies and for...
That's your pitch. That's a good pitch. It's well put. You're quite right. Now, as a Byzantinist, I know I signed up for a certain amount of pain. Coming through liturgical manuscripts might be crossing that line, but you're exactly right. There's so much to be discovered in these texts and in studying them historically, culturally, and so on. And I'm really, really thankful that you wrote this article because it answered questions that I've had for a long time. Just scratching my head, which has no veil and very little hair. Oh, yeah, we should do something on men's hair or what's left of it another occasion. So thank you for writing it, and thank you for coming on the podcast, Gabriel. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks. It's been fun to be here.